Dylan sat at his usual table by the window, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors of Crestwood Cafe. The air smelled of brewed coffee and the faint sweetness of cinnamon, but it did little to settle his restlessness. He was staring at his laptop, the cursor blinking against the white screen, waiting for an idea to strike. It had been weeks since his last article, and he could feel the pressure building. He was supposed to be writing a feature piece on local ghost stories, easy clickbait for the town's online journal, but none of it felt real. He glanced up as the door jingled open, and his friends entered. Jason first, camera slung over his shoulder as always, then Emily, who looked like she had already been debating something with him. "You're late," Dylan muttered, half smiling, as they slid into the chairs across from him. "Blame Jason," Emily replied, rolling her eyes. "He thought the light outside was perfect for some artistic shots." Jason shrugged, unbothered. "You'll thank me when I get the perfect photo to sell this article. The dark side of Crestwood, real hauntings or small-town gossip. It's gonna blow up, man." Dylan leaned back, stretching his arms above his head. "If I could just get started," he sighed. "There's nothing compelling about these legends. I mean, yeah, they're creepy. But we've all heard the same stories 1,000 times." Emily raised an eyebrow. "You haven't heard the one about the Hands Trail?" Dylan blinked. "The what?" Jason set his camera down, leaning in as if the conversation had just gotten serious. Emily's tone shifted, becoming quieter, more focused. "The Hands Trail," she repeated. "It's this path out in the woods, north of town. Supposedly cursed. They say people who go there at night disappear, or come back different. Some swear they've seen hands, like actual hands, reaching out from the ground, trying to pull people down. Creepy as hell." Dylan stifled a laugh, glancing at Jason. "She's gotta be messing with us." Jason, however, didn't laugh. He just stared at Emily. "I've heard it too." For a moment, the cafe seemed quieter. The usual sounds, coffee machines humming, customers chatting, faded into the background. Dylan could feel a chill settle over the conversation. "All right," he said, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. "If there's a cursed trail in Crestwood, why haven't I heard about it before?" Emily leaned forward, her fingers tapping absently against the edge of the table. "Because no one talks about it anymore. Not really. It's one of those old stories, like from when our parents were kids. People think it's just a myth, so they don't bother mentioning it. But if you dig deep enough, there are records, old newspaper clippings, maybe some police reports. People have disappeared. Dylan. Recently, too." Jason nodded, flipping through the photos on his camera absent-mindedly. "Yeah, man. Last year, remember that guy Tyler who went missing? Some people said he was camping near the Hansa Trail. They never found him." Dylan frowned. Tyler Garrison. He had been a year ahead of Dylan in high school. It had been all over the news when he vanished. But Dylan had assumed it was just another tragic case of someone getting lost in the dense forests around Crestwood. He'd never considered there might be more to it. "So, what's the deal?" Dylan asked, intrigued despite himself. "What's the story?" Emily shifted in her seat, her voice lowering even more. "The story goes that a long time ago, like before the town was even really settled, there was a family that lived near the woods. Some kind of tragedy happened. No one knows exactly what, but after that, people started disappearing. They say the ground where the family lived became cursed. And now, anyone who walks the Hansa Trail at night might not come back." Dylan leaned back, folding his arms. "And you believe this?" Emily shrugged. "I don't know if I believe it, but I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss it either." "Sounds like a good article," Jason grinned, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "We could go there, check it out, see if there's anything to the legend." Dylan gave him a skeptical look. "You want to go now?" Jason smirked. "Why not? What's the worst that could happen?" Emily shot him a look. "You really want to go out there at night?" Dylan glanced between them, the sense of unease deepening. He could feel the pull of the story. Maybe this was what he needed. Something real. Something that might actually sell, or at the very least, it would give him something to write about. He leaned forward, smirking. "Let's do it." They left the cafe as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the warm hues of daylight giving way to the cold blue of twilight. The drive out of town was quiet. and the closer they got to the edge of the woods, the more Dylan felt the weight of the trees pressing in on them. Crestwood was surrounded by dense forest, most of it untouched, the kind of wilderness that made you feel like you were the first person to set foot there. They parked the car at the trailhead, where a battered old sign warned against trespassing after dark. Of course, that only made Jason more eager. He grabbed his camera, leading the way with a flashlight in hand. Emily followed closely behind, the nervous energy radiating off her in waves. Dylan brought up the rear, the weight of the unknown settling heavily on his shoulders. "Just a quick walk," Jason said, his voice too loud in the stillness. "We'll get some shots, maybe catch something spooky, and then we're out of here." But as they stepped onto the trail, something felt wrong. Dylan couldn't quite place it, but the air was thicker, colder than it had been just a moment ago. The trees loomed overhead, their branches interlocking like skeletal fingers, casting long shadows across the ground. The trail itself was uneven, the dirt loose under their feet, as if it had been disturbed recently. Emily stopped suddenly, her breath catching. "Did you feel that?" Jason laughed. "Feel what?" She hesitated, looking down at the ground. "It moved." Dylan frowned, stepping closer to her. He knelt, running his hand over the dirt. It was loose, almost like sand, but not quite. He stood up, brushing his hands off on his jeans. "It's just soft ground." Emily didn't look convinced, but she continued walking. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew colder still, and the trees seemed to close in tighter around them. The trail, once a clear path, became harder to follow, the dirt shifting underfoot as if trying to push them back. Jason stopped to snap a few photos, the flash of his camera startling in the growing darkness. Dylan glanced over his shoulder, an inexplicable sense of being watched creeping up his spine. He shook it off. There was nothing here. It was just an old story, a legend, nothing more. But then from the corner of his eye, he saw it, a flicker of movement just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Something, or someone, was watching. The flash of Jason's camera pierced through the thickening darkness, illuminating the jagged shapes of the trees for only a brief second, before plunging them back into shadow. Dylan squinted, blinking away the spots in his vision, the sudden contrast of light and dark disorienting. Emily stood still, her breath shallow, eyes darting between the dense trees as if something unseen might lunge out at them at any moment. Jason, oblivious to the growing tension, checked his camera and frowned. "Damn, the lighting's terrible out here. It's not picking up anything decent. Maybe we should go back," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising wind. "I don't like this." Dylan wasn't one to spook easily, but he couldn't deny the unease settling over him. The forest felt wrong, more than wrong. It was as though it had been waiting for them, and now that they were here, it had started to wake up. He shook his head, trying to rationalize the creeping dread as just nerves. They had all psyched themselves up talking about the Hands Trail. That was all this was, fear feeding on itself. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite name. The way the ground seemed to shift under his feet, like the earth was alive, or how the trees looked twisted in the weak beams of their flashlights, their bark gnarled like ancient skin. The deeper they went, the less it felt like a simple trail in the woods. It felt watched. "I think we've gone far enough," Dylan said, his voice a little too firm, trying to keep control of the situation. "We got what we needed, a few shots for the article. Let's head back before it gets too dark." Jason ignored him, focused on adjusting the settings on his camera. "We haven't even reached the spot yet. The trail gets weirder the farther you go, remember." "Weird enough for me?" Emily muttered under her breath. Dylan glanced at her, noticing how tightly she was gripping the strap of her backpack, knuckles white. She was usually the level-headed one, but tonight, there was an edge to her anxiety that unsettled him. And then there was Jason, too eager, too focused on getting the perfect shot, as if he didn't even notice the way the air seemed to thicken with every step. The wind picked up, rustling the branches above them. Leaves fluttered down like dead insects, and for a moment, Dylan swore he heard something beneath the rustling, something soft, like a whisper. He stopped, turning his head slightly to listen. Nothing but the wind. Still, his pulse quickened, and his mind raced with thoughts of the old stories Emily had told him earlier. The ground moved. No, that was ridiculous. "Dude, come on," Jason called over his shoulder, already several steps ahead, his flashlight bobbing as he walked deeper into the gloom. "We've got to be close." Dylan gritted his teeth, debating whether to call him back or just follow. He didn't want to admit it, but there was a part of him that felt an irrational pull to continue. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was something else, something deeper, urging him to see the trail for what it really was, to prove it was just a story, just a legend. He motioned for Emily to follow, and together they trailed after Jason, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound in the oppressive silence. The deeper they went, the more distorted the world around them became. The trees grew closer together, their trunks twisted and thick, like they were guarding something. The path was no longer clear. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed it up, the dirt shifting beneath them, almost too soft to be solid ground. Suddenly, Jason stopped, lowering his camera. "Did you guys hear that?" Dylan froze, heart pounding in his chest. "Hear what?" Jason turned slowly, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the trees. "I thought I heard footsteps behind us." Emily let out a shaky laugh. "Very funny, Jason. Cut it out." "I'm not joking." His voice was tight now, the bravado gone. "I swear I heard something back there." Dylan instinctively turned to look behind them, his flashlight slicing through the dark. But there was nothing, just the endless stretch of trees and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. His mind raced with possibilities, an animal, maybe. But the way Jason was looking, the way he kept staring into the shadows, made Dylan's skin crawl. "Let's just keep moving," he muttered, not entirely sure if he was trying to reassure his friends or himself. "We're probably just freaked out because of the stories." But as they continued walking, that nagging feeling of being followed refused to leave. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground was trying to drag them down. And then, all at once, the air changed. Cold. So cold that Dylan could see his breath fogging in front of him, even though the night had been warm when they started. Emily shivered beside him, hugging her arms to her chest. Jason had stopped taking pictures altogether, his face tense as he swept the flashlight around, searching for something he couldn't quite see. "What the hell?" Jason muttered, but his words trailed off as something caught his eye. At first, Dylan didn't see it, but then, as Jason's flashlight lingered on a patch of dirt to the left of the trail, Dylan's breath caught in his throat. The ground. It was moving. Not like a normal shift in loose dirt or the settling of earth. No, this was different. The soil seemed to ripple, like something was just beneath the surface, pushing upward, trying to break free. "Is that?" Emily's voice was barely a whisper. Dylan stepped forward, his flashlight trembling slightly as he focused the beam on the spot. He could see it now, faint, but undeniable. The outline of fingers, human fingers, pale and skeletal, stretching upward from the earth, as if clawing their way out of a shallow grave. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. They were frozen in place, staring in horrified fascination at the impossible sight before them. And then, without warning, the hand jerked upward, fingers twitching, grasping at the air. Emily screamed. "Run!" Dylan shouted, grabbing her arm and yanking her back toward the trail. Jason was already ahead of them, sprinting down the narrow path, his camera forgotten as panic took hold. The forest seemed to close in around them as they ran, branches scratching at their faces and arms, the ground beneath their feet shifting with every step. The once familiar path had transformed into a twisted maze, the trees pressing closer, their limbs like claws reaching out to grab them. But it wasn't just the trees. Dylan could feel it now, the presence that had been lurking just out of sight, waiting for them to get too close. The hands, they were everywhere. He could see them in the corners of his vision, pale and desperate, reaching up from the earth, trying to pull them down. The further they ran, the more the ground seemed to shift beneath them, like it was alive, like it was hunting them. "Dylan!" Emily's voice was high-pitched, filled with terror. She was falling behind. her breath coming in ragged gasps as she struggled to keep up. He turned back, heart hammering in his chest, grew and grabbed her hand, pulling her forward. But it was no use. The forest was closing in on them, the path disappearing beneath their feet. And the hands were getting closer. Jason was nowhere to be seen. "Where the hell is he?" Dylan shouted. But there was no answer, only the sound of the wind and the rustling of leaves. Emily stumbled, nearly falling as the ground gave way beneath her. We can't stay here," she gasped, her eyes wide with panic. Dylan nodded, forcing himself to focus. They had to keep moving, but the more they ran, the more the forest seemed to twist around them, the trees growing thicker, the air colder, and the hands, they were everywhere now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, clawing at the ground, desperate to pull them under. Emily let out a choked sob, clutching onto Dylan's arm as they stumbled forward. "We have to find Jason," she whimpered. "We can't leave him." Dylan swallowed hard, his mind racing. They had to go back. They had to find him. But as he turned to look behind them, the path they had come from was gone, swallowed up by the forest. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no going back. "Keep moving," he muttered, more to himself than to Emily. "Just keep moving." But as they pressed forward, the hands grew bolder, reaching higher, their fingers brushing against their legs, their shoes. Dylan could feel the cold grip of them, pulling, tugging, and with each step, it grew harder to resist. The whispering started again, faint at first, like the wind, but it grew louder with every passing second, a low murmur of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Dylan could barely make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate. "Help us. Stay with us. Rest." The whispers wrapped around his mind, and for a brief moment, he felt the pull, the promise of rest, of peace. It would be so easy to stop, to let the hands take him. But then Emily screamed again, snapping him back to reality. The forest had swallowed the trail whole. Dylan and Emily stumbled through the twisted trees, their breaths coming in short, desperate gasps. The cold fingers of the wind clawed at them, carrying with it that unsettling whisper, always just beyond the edge of understanding. They didn't speak anymore. There was no point. The only sound between them now was the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant, constant rustle of movement. Hands. They were everywhere. Dylan glanced at Emily, her face pale and hollow, her eyes wide with terror as she glanced back, again and again, as if expecting the ground itself to rise up and take her. "Jason!" she cried, her voice cracking against the silence. She had called for him dozens of times already, but there was no answer, only the echo of her desperation swallowed by the trees. Dylan's mind raced, trying to keep his grip on reality. There was no way they could have lost the path so quickly. They had been running, just running, following the trail. But now, everywhere they turned looked the same. Trees so dense they blocked out the moonlight. Earth shifting and pulling like the forest was alive, warping around them, closing in. His flashlight flickered, and for a split second, he thought he saw something move just ahead. A figure, blurred in the darkness, but unmistakable. "Wait!" Dylan stopped, grabbing Emily's arm to hold her back. Her eyes snapped to his, wild with panic. "What? What did you see?" He didn't answer right away. He wasn't even sure. But then there was another flicker of movement, closer this time. A shadow, hunched and low, moving between the trees. "Jason!" Dylan called out, but his voice faltered as he strained to see through the thick gloom. The figure had vanished. Emily clutched his arm tighter, her nails digging into his skin. "Dylan, we need to go, now!" He nodded, but his feet wouldn't move. Something held him rooted to the spot, an inexplicable pull that made his muscles tense, his mind reel with questions. What had he seen? Was it really Jason, or was it something else? Then a voice, soft, almost too quiet to hear, rose from the darkness. "Help!" It was Jason. It had to be. Dylan turned, breaking from Emily's grip, and stumbled forward, his flashlight beam wavering. "Jason, where are you?" "Dylan, don't!" Emily pleaded behind him, her voice thick with terror. "We need to stick together, please." But Dylan couldn't stop. The voice, it was so faint, so fragile, he had to follow it. The trees seemed to part just enough to let him through, the forest shifting again, opening a path that hadn't been there a moment ago. The ground was softer now, almost like quicksand beneath his boots, sucking at his steps, slowing him down. But he pressed on, calling Jason's name, praying for an answer that didn't come. He didn't notice it at first, the subtle pressure around his ankles, the cool, sickly touch of something brushing against his skin. It wasn't until he felt the tug, firm, deliberate, that he looked down. Hands. Pale skeletal fingers were creeping up from the dirt, their grip cold and desperate, wrapping around his legs, pulling him down. Shit! Dylan yanked his foot back, stumbling, his heart slamming against his ribs. He fell hard, his back hitting the earth with a dull thud, the wind knocked out of him. For a moment, everything was a blur. The world spinning, his flashlight rolling out of his hand, casting strange, distorted shadows through the trees. But then he saw them, all of them, dozens of hands, maybe more, clawing their way out of the ground. Thin, emaciated fingers stretching toward him, some already wrapping around his boots, his jeans, pulling, dragging him toward the soft earth that had started to give way beneath him. Dylan scrambled, panic flooding his veins as he kicked at the hands, but there were too many. Their cold grip tightened with every struggle, pulling him down inch by inch. "Dylan!" Emily screamed, her voice distant, distorted, as if the forest itself had swallowed her sound. He tried to call out, but the ground was opening beneath him, the earth yawning like a hungry mouth. His fingers clawed at the loose dirt, trying to find something solid to hold on to, but the soil crumbled between his hands. Just as the cold grip of the earth began to swallow his waist, a sudden, blinding flash lit up the forest. Jason's camera. It lay abandoned a few feet away, its flash going off at random intervals, triggered by something unseen. Emily was there in a heartbeat, grabbing his arms, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Hold on!" she cried, her voice strained as she pulled with everything she had. Dylan could feel her trembling, hear her sobbing as she struggled against the force pulling him under. The hands were relentless, their grip tightening around his legs, dragging him deeper into the cold, wet earth. He could feel the soil rising up around his chest now, pressing in on him, suffocating. But Emily didn't let go. She screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the forest, and with one final desperate tug, she wrenched Dylan free. They both collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. For a long moment, neither of them moved, too shocked, too drained to do anything but lie there in the dirt, staring up at the twisted, skeletal branches above them. But the forest didn't rest. The ground around them continued to shift, the whispers growing louder now, more urgent. The hands, they hadn't stopped. They were still reaching, still clawing, just inches away from where Dylan lay. "We have to go," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. She grabbed Dylan's arm, pulling him to his feet. "Now!" He didn't argue. His legs were weak, his muscles burning from the struggle. But he forced himself to move. Together, they stumbled through the forest, the ground shifting beneath them with every step, the whispers following them, growing louder, more insistent. Stay. Rest. The voices seemed to seep into their minds, wrapping around their thoughts like a cold fog. Dylan could feel the pull, the temptation to stop, to give in to the promises of peace, of rest. It would be so easy to let go, to stop running. But Emily's hand was tight around his, grounding him in the moment, keeping him moving forward. They couldn't stop. Not now. They broke through the trees into a small clearing, the moonlight filtering down through the gaps in the branches, casting everything in a cold, pale glow. Dylan doubled over, his hands on his knees as he gasped for air, his lungs burning. Emily stood beside him, her face pale and streaked with dirt, her eyes wide with fear. "Where? Where is Jason?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Dylan shook his head, his heart sinking. "I don't know." The realization hit them both at once. Jason was gone, lost somewhere in the twisted maze of trees and shifting earth, swallowed up by the trail and the forest. The forest was still hungry. "We have to find him," Emily said, her voice growing frantic again. "We can't just leave him out there." But Dylan didn't move. He couldn't. The weight of the forest pressed down on him, the memory of those hands pulling at his mind, dragging him back to that moment of panic, of helplessness. He had barely escaped. How could they go back? How could they survive another encounter with whatever lived beneath that cursed ground? "Dylan," Emily pleaded, her voice cracking. "Wait, please." He looked at her, his chest tight with guilt, but even as he opened his mouth to speak, the ground beneath them began to shift again. The earth trembled, a low, almost imperceptible rumble that grew stronger with each passing second. The trees around them creaked, their branches swaying in the sudden gusts of cold wind. And then, from the edge of the clearing, the hands emerged again. Dozens of them, maybe more, clawing their way up from the soil, their pale skeletal fingers stretching toward them, desperate, hungry. "We have to move," Dylan whispered, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her back toward the tree line. But as they turned to run, a figure appeared at the far edge of the clearing. Jason. He stood there, just beyond the reach of the pale moonlight, his silhouette blurred by the shadows. His head was down, his shoulders slumped, as if he was barely standing. "Jason!" Emily screamed, running toward him before Dylan could stop her. But as she reached him, Jason lifted his head, and Dylan's blood ran cold. His eyes were hollow, dark pits where light should have been. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his lips were twisted into a strange, eerie smile. "Jason," Emily whispered, her voice trembling as she reached out to touch him. But Jason didn't respond. He didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes locked on hers. That unnatural smile frozen on his face, and then, without warning, he lunged,